I'm Gabriel, and this is The Rare Mind. Today we're diving into the 10 brutal truths INFJs and INTJs rarely admit, and we'll use Nietzsche's fire as our guide to see why those struggles aren't flaws, but signs of something deeper burning inside. Stay until the end, because that's when everything connects into a framework you can actually live by. There are moments when silence feels heavier than any spoken word. For INFJs and INTJs, this weight comes from living with perceptions that few can echo back. Their way of seeing pierces through appearances, yet the world seldom has the patience or courage to follow. The result is a peculiar exile, one that is not chosen but endured, like carrying a lantern in a land content with darkness. This struggle is not loud. It is the quiet ache of realizing that one's language of depth has no translation. Nietzsche once spoke of the thinker condemned to solitude, not as punishment but as destiny. His image of the lonely figure, standing apart, validates what these types feel daily. Their isolation is not failure, but the very mark of their vocation. The philosopher does not seek the crowd. He is drawn into silence by necessity. In that silence, something raw is born. I know what it means to carry ideas that no one around me can hold without trembling or turning away. For INFJs, the wound manifests as emotional solitude. They long for a connection that touches the soul itself, a conversation that unveils essence instead of circling around surfaces. They crave not just companionship but communion, and when denied, they live with a hunger that no noise can satisfy. Sometimes it just hurts. The sound of laughter in the next room can feel like a locked door to a feast where their hunger is invisible. INTJs, in contrast, know exile in the realm of thought. Their frustration arises not from absence of affection, but from the shallowness of ideas around them. To be surrounded by conversations that do not move beyond repetition feels like breathing thin air. Their exile is intellectual, born of a refusal to settle for the ordinary patterns of thought. The sharper their vision, the more foreign the environment feels. And yet, do they not secretly wonder if the crowd was never meant to understand? What unites both experiences is the recognition that solitude is not an accident. It is the price of vision. INFJs and INTJs walk paths that demand distance from the noise of the herd, not to elevate themselves above others, but to see what others will not. The practice, then, is to reframe loneliness into purpose, to sit in the silence, not as abandon, but is entrusted with a fire that cannot be carried by many. The lantern is heavy, yes, but it was never meant to be discarded. Loneliness then ceases to be a wound and becomes a threshold. The isolation that once felt like exile can be recast as vocation, as the birthmark of those called to think and feel beyond the common horizon. It is not about escaping the world, but about carrying a vision that may one day illuminate it. To accept this is to step into one's destiny, even if the path wins through shadows. The truth is brutal. You will not always be understood. But it is also liberating. You were not made to be understood, but to reveal there is a peculiar burden that follows those who see further than most. It is not simply the weight of their own ideals, but the invisible demand projected onto them by others. For INFJs, this burden often appears as an unspoken contract to heal, to soothe, to be the quiet anchor in a storm. People lean on their presence without asking, assuming their empathy is endless. And INFJs internalize this demand until exhaustion becomes their silent companion. For INTJs, the demand takes a sharper shape. They are expected to lead, to deliver, to engineer outcomes with unwavering precision. Competence becomes a trap. Once they prove capable, the world insists on their constant efficiency, as though strength were their only currency. And yet, to be reduced to a function wounds them deeply. I have felt this pressure myself, the quiet suffocation of living inside the expectations others weave for me, as if my life were a stage where I must perform their scripts. Nietzsche speaks of self-overcoming, a call to resist the easy submission to roles dictated by society. His challenge is clear: to step beyond the scripts others hand us, even if it means disappointing them. For INFJs, this means daring to say no, refusing to bleed endlessly for causes that deny their own needs. For INTJs, it means detaching from the compulsion to always deliver, reclaiming the right to fail, to pause, to exist outside the machinery of expectation. Sometimes, the most radical act is to refuse. But this refusal does not come without tension. The fear of letting others down eats at them, turning compassion into guilt for INFJs and responsibility into bitterness for INFJs. What begins as devotion curdles into resentment when their own needs are denied too long. And here lies the danger. The very gifts that make them valuable, clarity, strategy, become poisoned by the hidden weight of obligation. How long can a soul carry the world before collapsing under its silence? The first act of liberation is to recognize that these expectations were never chosen. They are inherited, absorbed, imposed. The practice is to set boundaries, not as walls, but as acts of truth. To speak one's limits is not selfishness, but fidelity to the deeper self that calls within. In this, light your boundaries becomes sacred line, where external pressure meets internal clarity. The rain on the window, the sound of water tapping glass reminds me, even storms know when to break. When INFJs and INTJs learn to shed the false mantles placed upon them, the weight shifts. What once crushed becomes fuel. Their guidance and leadership, once burdened by duty, can then flow from freedom. To live from inner truth is not to abandon responsibility, but to bear it with strength that is chosen rather than demanded. Expectations will always surround them, but no longer will they dictate the shape of their soul. True strength is born when the burden is no longer borrowed. To live with foresight is to feel the temptation of control. INFJs and INTJs, in their different ways, dream of mastery not only over themselves, but over the unpredictable fabric of life. Beneath their calm exteriors often lies a restless will to order, a refusal to surrender to the disorder of existence. Yet this dream of control is an illusion, a subtle trap that breeds more rigidity than freedom. I want to hear from you. Which one cuts closer? The perfection trap or the fear of mediocrity? Write it down in the comments, even in one sentence. Naming it out loud is often the first spark toward transforming it. I'll be reading what you share, and it may shape the next video we build together. Nietzsche reminds us that true strength is not found in mastery over chaos, but in the courage to embrace it. The dance of life is not choreography, but improvisation. When we grasp too tightly, we strangle vitality itself. I have felt the sting of this truth in my own life. The moments when my attempts to control outcomes only left me more confined, more afraid of what I could not shape. For INFJs, control wears the mask of empathy. They seek to orchestrate harmony in relationships, smoothing tensions, curating atmospheres where peace could reign. Their influence is gentle, yet it conceals a hidden fear that, if they do not manage the emotional weather, the storm will consume them. It is a quiet control, dressed as care. Sometimes the silence after conflict feels heavier than the conflict itself. INTJs, on the other hand, craft strategies like architects of destiny. They map variables, anticipate moves, and engineer solutions, often with startling precision, yet their strength can curdle into rigidity when they confuse prediction with possession. To design a path is not to own it. The world resists their blueprints, and in that resistance, frustration hardens into How many times must the unexpected arrive before they learn that unpredictability is not failure, but the soil of creation? The practice, then, is surrender, not passivity, but the art of releasing control so that insight transforms into creativity. INFJs can allow empathy to move without needing to curate every response. Let strategy serve possibility instead of choking it. Like a hand that finally opens, their grip loosens, and what they once tried to dominate becomes a source of inspiration. The illusion of control dies when chaos is not an enemy but a companion. In that embrace, both INFJs and INTJs discover a deeper freedom. They cease to live as guardians against disaster and begin to live as creators with the unpredictable. And in this strange freedom, they find that their vision is not diminished but sharpened. Life does not need to be mastered to be meaningful. It only needs to be met. Beneath the soft compassion of the INFJ and the cold clarity of the INTJ lies a truth both resist. They hunger for power. Not crude dominance, not the shallow applause of status, but the deeper force of shaping reality itself. This desire is often buried beneath layers of humility or pragmatism, disguised even from their own awareness. Yet it lives undeniable, like a flame hidden in the chest, waiting for air. For INFJs, this longing often takes the form of influence invisible hand guiding hearts and minds toward transformation. They may frame it as service, yet underneath pulses the wish to leave a mark, to bend the currents of human story toward meaning. For INTJs, the hunger is sharper, more defined, power through competence, through systems that endure, through victories of design over disorder. They want to build, to command, to orchestrate the unseen mechanics of the future. I confess, I have felt this fire, and I have feared it. Nietzsche's notion of the will to power exposes what polite society prefers to conceal. Power is not shameful, he insists. It is the essence of life. Striving to deny it is to cripple one's own vitality. Yet INFJs and INTJs often repress this drive, fearing it may corrupt them, fearing that desire itself is a betrayal of purity or reason. But what happens to power denied? It turns inward, fermenting into passive resentment for INFJs or silence. Sabotage for INTJs. The signs are subtle. The INFJ who feels invisible, yet manipulates quietly to be felt. The INTJ who, dismissed or obstructed, retreats into icy contempt while plotting superiority in silence. Power and noun becomes poison, leaking into relationships, staining clarity with bitterness. Can one truly escape the hunger for power, or does repression only twist it into shadow? The practice is not suppression, but ownership. To admit the will to power is to release it from shame, to transfigure it into authentic leadership. For INFJs, this means allowing their influence to be conscious, wielded with integrity rather than guilt. For INTJs, it means embracing ambition not as domination, but as creation of power to build without apology. Like a river no longer dammed, their energy flows clean when it is claimed. In this ownership, power ceases to be corruption and becomes calling. The INFJ's presence heals because it is deliberately given, not unconsciously imposed. The INTJ's vision leads because it is openly embraced, not hidden behind masks of indifference. The hidden desire for power, when brought into light, becomes the strength that shapes reality without shame. To hunger is not weakness. To deny hunger is perfection whispers like a false prophet. It promises safety, dignity, transcendence, but delivers only chains. For INFJs and INTJs, this whisper is almost irresistible. The INFJ seeks moral purity, a flawless alignment between inner truth and outer action. The INTJ pursues immaculate execution, a system without cracks, a plan immune to error. Both believe perfection will free them from the ache of inadequacy. Instead, it cages them in self-reproach. When I mentioned that silent weight INFJs carry, always expected to heal or guide others, you felt that knot in your chest, pause and hit like, that simple act tells me these truths matter to you, and it signals to YouTube to keep showing you insights right when you need them most. Fool. The INFJ imperfection feels like betrayal. A harsh word, a failure to live up to their own ideals, becomes proof of unworthiness. They turn their compassion outward but lash inward with shame. For the INTJ, mistakes become unforgivable interruptions. Each error replayed like a broken record until strategy hardens into self. I know the taste of this prisonous sense that unless I act flawlessly, I do not deserve to act at all. Sometimes, I freeze before the first step. Nietzsche warned that perfection is paralysis. Greatness does not emerge from the absence of flaw, but from the embrace of imperfection as the forge of strength. The sculptor does not wait for unbroken marble. He shapes the cracked stone. Why, then, do INFJs and INTJs demand an impossible purity of themselves when even life itself thrives through rupture, mistake, and recovery? The tragedy is that in seeking perfection, they often stagnate. The INFJ, unwilling to act without moral certainty, lingers in dreams that never incarnate. The INTJ, unwilling to move without precision, waits endlessly for conditions that never arrive. What if the insistence on perfection is the very thing that robs them of greatness? The silence of an untouched canvas can be more crushing than the noise of flawed creation. The practice is radical imperfection. To write the imperfect line, to speak the unpolished truth, to attempt knowing failure will arrive. This is not recklessness, but curves the willingness to be seen unfinished. For INFJs, it means releasing the shame of moral fracture. For INTJs, the terror of miscalculation. Perfection dies when boldness lives. In embracing imperfection, their vitality returns. Life, after all, is not a mirror polished to brilliance, but a river carrying both mud and light. To live is to risk blemish, and to risk blemish is to discover beauty deeper than flawlessness. The brutal truth is this: perfection is not the crown of greatness, but its enemy. What liberates is the crack, the stumble, the wound that makes the song human. Greatness belongs not to the flawless, but to the daring. There is a fire that haunts both INFJs and INTJs, the dread of living a life that dissolves into nothingness. For INFJs, this fear emerges as the terror of insignificance, a life without depth, without impact, without the echo of meaning. For INTJs, it is the fear of irrelevance, of being swallowed in a world run by average minds and shallow ambitions. Mediocrity is not merely undesirable, it feels like death in slow motion. Nietzsche's flame cuts directly into this fear. He calls for transcendence of the herd, the refusal to settle into the numb comfort of conformity. To live without creation, without the spark of originality, is to betray the very will that animates life. Yet this fire left unchecked can burn from within. I have felt its bite, the voice that tells me I must do more, achieve more, or I am nothing. At times, that voice has left me restless, unable to rest even in beauty. This fear fuels ambition. INFJs channel it into the search for soul-level work, yearning to leave behind a legacy of compassion and truth. Their dread of emptiness propels them towards service that transforms. Yet it also corrodes their peace, for no achievement feels deep enough to silence the hunger. For INTJs, the fear sharpens into relentless striving, new systems, greater visions, higher mountains to climb. And still, even victories are short-lived, quickly overshadowed by the next horizon. Does the fear ever loosen its grip, or does it endlessly disguise itself as drive? The danger is that in fearing mediocrity, they lose the ability to dwell in the present. The INFJ's meaning hunger makes every simple joy feel fragile, almost guilty. The INTJ's ambition converts every pause into wasted time. In chasing greatness, they risk missing life itself, a smell of rain and the soil, the warmth of a single glance, the fragile eternity in an ordinary day. The practice is not to extinguish the fire, but to temper it, to channel fear into authentic work that emerges not from comparison, but from necessity of spirit. INFJs can seek depth, not in grand gestures, but in the daily offering of presence. INTJs can pursue excellence not for escape from mediocrity, but for the joy of creation itself. Like musicians playing for the love of sound, their striving becomes song rather than compulsion. When fear is transformed into fuel, mediocrity no longer looms as an enemy, but fades as an illusion. For the truth is simple. Greatness is not the absence of average moments, but the courage to create within them. The brutal truth is that no one escapes ordinariness entirely, but within it the extraordinary can ignite. To live with Nietzsche's fire is not to escape mediocrity, but to burn through it into meaning. Idealism begins as a bright flame, pure, intoxicating, radiant with promise. For INFJ and INTJs, it feels almost sacred, as though life must bend toward their vision of what should be. Yet, when held too tightly, that flame blinds rather than guides. It turns the raw pulse of life into disappointment. For reality never bends without fracture. For INFJs, idealism often attaches to people and love. They dream of perfect bonds, of a soulmate who sees them completely, of a mission or cause untainted by corruption. Their hearts ache when reality intrudes, when human flaws disturb their dream of purity. I know this ache to stare into someone's eyes and wish they could be more than they are, only to taste heartbreak when they remain themselves. Sometimes, the silence after disillusionment is louder than the laughter that once promised forever. INTJs, by contrast, fall in love with systems. They craft theories and structures, models of precision meant to explain or organize the world. Yet reality is stubbornly uncooperative, messy, irrational, human. Their disappointment is quieter than the INFJ's heartbreak, but no less. Cutting is the bitterness of watching elegant designs collapse under the weight of human imperfection. How many times can one redraw the blueprint before admitting the world will never match the sketch? Nietzsche warns that chasing ideals can become a sickness. To demand perfection of life is to betray life's raw vitality. The more tightly we cling to what should be, the more we fail to embrace what is. For INFJs, the danger is living in perpetual grief over illusions shattered. For INTJs, it is disillusionment curdling into cynicism, as if reality itself were an enemy. The practice is dangerous. Honesty, to look at the world without filters and still say yes. INFJs must allow love to be flawed, human, partial, and still precious. INTJs must let systems remain incomplete, messy, adaptive, and still worthwhile. It is not the ideal that gives life its weight, but the courage to walk with imperfection without losing vision. Idealism, unchecked, becomes exile from reality. But when transfigured, it becomes a compass rather than a cage. The brutal truth is this: life will never match the purity of vision. And yet, to stand in the imperfection and still create, still love, still believe, that is greatness. Idealism becomes dangerous only when it demands escape. When it accepts fracture, it becomes fire. Resentment grows in silence. It begins as a whisper, almost invisible, and hardens slowly until it becomes a shadow that poisons everything it touches. For INFJ and INTJs, this shadow is often hidden behind composure, disguised under roles of helper or strategist. But beneath the calm exterior, something unsettled burns. For INFJs, the pattern is familiar. Anger is repressed in the name of harmony, empathy, or self. They swallow words, absorb wounds, until bitterness builds like sediment in a riverbed. The result is martyrdom disguised as virtue, guilt tangled with quiet rage. I have lived this cycle, giving past my limits, smiling while hollow. Inside, only to wake with resentment like smoke in my chest. Sometimes, it feels like my silence has betrayed me more than the offense itself. INTJs, meanwhile, express resentment in sharper lines. They dismiss, detach, withdraw into contempt. What begins as clarity seeing flaws, spotting incompetence ferments into cold superiority when never released. They cease engaging, choosing instead to stand above, as if distance could cleanse them. But distance does not cleanse. How long can contempt be held before it hardens into arrogance? Nietzsche named this poison resentment, the inversion of strength into bitterness when power remains unexpressed. It is not anger itself that destroys, but the refusal to own it, the burying of will until it turns toxic. For INFJs, the cost is self. For INTJs, the cost is isolation atop a throne of disdain. The practice is expression, not explosion, but clarity. For INFJs, this means daring to speak limits before silence turns to resentment. For INTJs, it means choosing engagement over detachment, allowing frustration to fuel constructive change rather than contempt. Like lightning released from a storm, anger purified becomes energy, not poison. Notice how we not just listing traits. We're pulling apart illusions like the craving for control that secretly imprisons both INFJs and INTJs. If you want to keep unpacking these raw truths without the sugarcoating, subscribe now. Every week, we build tools that turn inner tension into clarity. Resentment, if ignored, becomes a shadow that steals vitality. But when faced, it transforms into strength. The brutal truth is that both INFJs and INTJs are not as serene as they pretend. Beneath the calm, a storm waits. Only by naming it, owning it, releasing it, can they step out of the shadow and into their true fire. At some point, the mask begins to crack. The roles, the expectations, the ideals all feel like borrowed garments, heavy and ill. For INFJ and INTJs, this breaking is not a collapse but a summons to become who they are. Nietzsche's words echo like thunder here, an imperative, not a suggestion. Life demands that they burn down the scripts and step naked into the unknown. For INFJs, self-creation means aligning vision with authentic service. Not the compulsive sacrifice of self, but the deliberate offering of their presence where it resonates most deeply. It is choosing not every cause, but the cause that feels written into their marrow. For INTJs, it means building systems that carry their mark into the future, structures that outlast their fleeting existence. Both must abandon borrowed identities, the masks of harmony or competence, to discover the self that can only be forged through fire. I know the terror of this fire. To shed an old identity feels like dying because in truth, it is. The self that once protected us must be buried so that another can rise. And yet, every time I have dared to let go, I found anew strength, breathing beneath the ashes. Is there any creation without destruction first? This transformation is not gentle. It demands the courage to disappoint others, to betray the smaller versions of oneself, that once felt safe. It requires INFJs to release the martyr, INTJs to release the architect who must control every stone. Both must surrender certainty for authenticity. The process feels like tearing, but it is in the tearing that the hidden seed finally sees light. The practice is simple but ruthless. Ask what must die in order for you to live. Write it, name it, confront it. Then act in small ways that betray the old self. Speak where you once swallowed words. Pause where you once rushed to control. Risk where you once demanded guarantees. Transformation is not a single leap, but a series of daily betrayals of the false self. Self-creation is the highest calling, but also the most dangerous. It will strip, unsettle, burn, and yet it births destiny from conflict, meaning from fracture. The brutal truth is this: no one else can define you, and no old identity can contain you. To become who you are is not comforted as fire. To live with fire is to live without apology. INFJs and INTJs thrive not when they hide from life's brutality, but when they embrace it, letting struggle carve depth into their being. The world tempts them toward escaping to idealism, control, or quiet resignation, but their destiny lies elsewhere, in saying yes to the flames that purify and consume. For INFJs, this fire demands the embrace of conflict as a path to authenticity. They long for peace, but peace bought with silence leaves them fractured. The moment they allow themselves to enter the storm, to risk rupture in the name of truth, they discover a freedom beyond harmony. I have walked into conversations trembling, afraid of breaking what little bond existed, only to find that honesty deepened the connection rather than destroyed it. Sometimes, fire builds what silence cannot. For INTJs, the fire asks for vulnerability. They are masters of structure, but strength without softness becomes brittle. To open themselves, to allow not just admiration, but intimacy, is the terrifying step that completes their strength. What use is brilliance if it cannot touch or be touched? In admitting need, they do not weaken but reveal a power far rarer than controlled the power to be human without disguise. Nietzsche's fire is not about domination but affirmation, to say yes to life, not despite its cruelty, but because of it. The pain, the failure, the solitude will become raw material for creation. The crack in the stone lets the chisel shape it. The chaos in the world gives vision something to resist. Can greatness exist without resistance? Or does resistance itself define greatness? The practice is boldness, lived daily. For INFJs, this may mean speaking truth instead of swallowing it, choosing authenticity even when misunderstood. For INTJs, it may mean allowing imperfection, letting others see their unfinished self without shame. Both are called to act not tomorrow, not when ready, but now. Fire only shapes those who step into it willingly. Integration arrives not as serenity, but as courage. To live with fire is to walk scarred but luminous, carrying the authority of one who has not escaped struggle but transformed through it. The brutal truth is that there is no easy life for INFJs or INTJs, but there is a great life one lived fiercely, vulnerably, unapologetically. To carry Nietzsche's fire is to become flame oneself, shaping reality not with fear, but with burning presence.